All right, so in this video, we are going to look at a few additional keywords that can be helpful when you're using conditionals in a looping type of structure. In particular, we're going to look at the keywords pass, continue, and break. All right, and for this, I'm just going to have a list. So let's say that we've got a MyList object, and we've got 1, 2, string for 3, 4. And then we've got 5 as a floating point number, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, so we've got this list. Let's assume that, we're expecting this list to be essentially a sequence of integers, right? Or at least the values contained within it to be integers. And what we want to do is write a loop to essentially go through and make sure that the various things that are contained in this list are integers, right? So we want it to flag us whenever something is not an integer. Now you can imagine that we could come up with a really kind of complicated if-else type of structure where we're checking not only is it integer, but instead looking at exactly what type is it. But let's just say we want to be able to flag and identify what things are not integers, and then maybe give us some information about the types that they are. And we're going to use enumerate. So we saw enumerate in a previous video in the flow control kind of series here. So we're going to use enumerate to help us figure out not only, this thing's not an integer, but what index position are the things that are not integers. All right, so let's look at this. So let's just think through. So first off, let's just build some infrastructure, how we would kind of loop through this. So we're going to use enumerate. So I'm going to say index item in enumerate my list. Just going to start that at 0. So that is the default there for enumerate, to start at 0. And then what we'll do is we will print, for now, I'm just going to print out the index and the item. All right, so that gives us our looping structure. So in index position 0, we have 1, we've got 2. Notice here when we get to index position 2, which is the third element, we see 3. It looks like that's an integer. We know it's not. That thing is a string, right? So it's the way that it's printing it to the screen, it just is removing those quotation marks. All right, so what we want to do is we want to build up some infrastructure to kind of check and say what things are not integers. All right, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the built-in isInstance. All right, so if I pass it something, in this case a 7, and I can pass it a built-in type, like an int, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a built-in type. I guess there can be third-party types from third-party libraries, but basically what it allows us to do, as long as we have some type of a class or a type, I can check and say, hey, is the thing that I passed you in this first argument of this type? So in this case, we got 7. I'm saying is 7 an integer? That evaluates to true. If I pass 7.0, that's a float, it's going to be false. All right, so that's what we're going to do for our conditional. And let's say that, what we want to do, we expect that the majority of time, these things are going to be integers, right? So in those cases, we don't want to, as I've kind of mentioned in the videos talking about conditional statements, if you have a case or you have some insight on the case that's going to be the most common, you might want to put it first in your conditional statement. Because again, if it is a very common case, as soon as that condition is verified for the cases where it is true, it's just going to exit out of that if-else type of structure, which could save you some time. So I'm going to say, well, if isInstance item, if it's an int, all right, I don't care. Right, so this is the case that we expect. So what we want to do, we expect the majority of our items to be integers, which that is in fact the case. So we only have these right here that are not integers. Those two are strings, and then 5.0 is a float. So we want to put that first. All right, and then let's just go ahead and think through, and I'm going to put an else here. And notice that Jupyter's fighting me, right? So right after this if statement, if I hit enter, it's wanting to nest. And then if I'm saying I'm going to try to force it out, so I'm hitting a backspace there, and I'm putting that else, right? It's automatically doing this nesting. So let's see if I can force it out. All right. So else, so if is instance, what I really want is for this to be do nothing, right? This is the passing case. We want to do nothing there. And then we'll say else, I'm going to say print, and let's make this a little bit more informative. Item at index has type. Whoops, let me close that off. And then I'm just going to put in the F string, I'm going to call the type of item. All right, this is not going to run, right? And this is the case that one of these first keywords that I'm going to be talking about is built for. So we have a very common case right here that we just want to check if that's true, do nothing. All right. Otherwise, we want to get some information back. Well, how do we say do nothing in a conditional in a Python loop, right? So that's what this first keyword is built for, right? And I guess you could actually use some of the other keywords for that, or at least one of the other keywords for that as well. But what we want to do is basically say do nothing. All right. And one of the keywords you can use for that is pass. So this is, as you see, it's a defined keyword. And what it's going to do is going to say, well, if this check is true, just continue like nothing happened. All right. All right. Let's see. I think I've got, oh, I didn't terminate my F string. So we had two errors. All right, so let me just show you that if I had my original do nothing there, right, so that still was not working, right? It expected an indented block, but that's a comment. Okay, so Python is not reading that. All right, so if we put pass, now it works, right? So the item at index 2, 0, 1, 2, right? That's a string. Index 3 is a string, and then we have a float there. All right, so we have this pass statement. All right, another way that you can do this is with continue. All right, so that seems to be returning the same result, right? So I'm gonna, if I do pass, that's what it looks like, or we can do continue. All right, there's a subtle difference between these. So let's just kind of look at those. Let's just look at the difference between continue and pass, because in this case, it seems like it's doing the same thing. All right, so to do this, I'm going to go back to an example I've used before of finding even numbers. So I'm going to say for number in range 1 to 11, and then we'll have our conditional. I'm going to say, well, if number 0, I'm going to say print, and then let's do F, and we don't need an F string here. I'll say I found an even number, and let's do the F string so that we can print the number. All right, so I'm going to put the number there that we found. Let's make sure. So I got to close off my print statement. There we go. All right, so if the number is, if we take the modulus of the number, essentially dividing it by 2 and looking at the remainder. If that's 0, we've got, in fact, an even number. All right. All right, so let's look at this. Let's say print the number is not even. All right, now this looks a little bit weird, right? And this is just really to demonstrate the differences between these two. All right, so usually we would probably put an else statement, right? So typically I would maybe put an else just to make sure that I've got it going to the right categories. But I want to leave this just kind of hanging out. So notice that my indentation, so it's not in the if statement. So if I were to run this right now, every time it's printing the number is not even. Right? That's what we expect, right? Because I'm iterating through each, it checks the conditional. If the conditional is true, it prints that. All right. And then this is outside of the conditional, so it's still in that for loop. It says, okay, well, I'm going to first check the condition, and then it's just moving down and executing this. All right. All right. So let's look at what we would do, or how these two, we looked at pass and continue. Sorry, I'm doing things everywhere. All right, what if I put a pass right here? All right, same behavior. All right, so I'm going through for number. It checks the conditional. It makes that print in case where it's even. And then I've got this code hanging out here at the bottom, and it's going to be executing that code, and it actually executes it every time. Let's put the number here to make it where we can see that it's executing it every time. So I'm gonna have to make that an F string and then copy that there. All right, so you can see the number's not even 2. Number's not even 4. Right, so this is getting executed in every iteration of the loop. Watch what happens when we do continue. All right, so in this case, it's actually behaving like a if else. Okay, so you might see when I would go from pass, right? Number's not even 2, so that's not correct. But if I put the continue statement there, all of a sudden those cases go away. Well, what's going on? Well, this is just showing the very subtle difference between those two statements. So in pass, all it's doing when it hits that statement is just saying, okay, it would not execute any code that's below that in the conditional. Okay. Now with continue, this actually is not operating at the conditional level. This is operating at the for level. Okay. So it's saying, hey, whenever this statement is true, so whenever I hit this continue, it doesn't execute any of this code below it in the for loop, but it goes back to the closest for loop, because you can have nested for loops, but it'll look what's the nearest for loop based on the indentation, and it says, okay, as soon as I hit that, stop and index. It's basically saying go back to the for loop right at that point where you hit it and go to the very next step. So it bypasses everything that follows. All right, so pass is just basically saying, hey, move on within this conditional. And that's in fact exactly what we wanted in this case above, where we were doing the is instance. We were saying, hey, we expect it to be an integer, just keep going, right? And we had the else here to guard against and say, hey, well, it's not an int, so print out the type. All right, and we saw that continue basically resulted in the same result, but they got there two different ways, right? So the pass is just working at this conditional, and since we had this else statement, kind of making sure that we didn't get in there if is instance item int is true, it worked exactly the same. But down here we saw that when we do continue, it actually will work and say everything that follows, don't do it, just iterate. And that can be extremely helpful. Again, if you've got, if certain cases arise, it could be, imagine that you're kind of parsing some type of data elements that are coming in, and some of them might be missing values. Well, you might want to check first and say, well, is it missing? If it is, just do something. And then you might have some really complex code down below to handle the cases where it's not missing. And you just, if it's missing, just record it as missing and move on. Don't execute all of this code, and continue can do that because it's going to increment that loop. All right. And the last one that we are going to look at is break. All right. So what, in this case, we're finding all of our even integers. What if we only want to find the first one, the first case of something? All right, well, we can use break in that case. So let's say that you've got this long list of, items, and you just want the first match. All right, so what you can do, so in this case, we got our for number and range. We're going to check our conditional. We're going to say we found an even number. Instead of continue, we're going to say break. Now, again, let's do this with pass, right? Or we don't even need pass, right? Let's just run it outright. All right, so for each one of these, we can see, well, we find in that range of 1 all the way up to 10. Remember, 11, it's not including that. All right, so it finds 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. What if we only care about finding the first? Well, we can use a break statement to say, hey, as soon as we encounter this, exit the innermost for loop. So in this case, it's going to find the even integer 2, and it's going to immediately say, hey, I found 1, exit that for loop. So again, if you've got huge lists and you're trying to search them for a particular entry, you could use a break statement to exit that out as soon as that first occurrence is encountered. All right, so that concludes this video, and we'll have one more in the flow control series here looking at while loops.